Now that the NHL trade deadline for 2023 has come and gone, let's take a look back at history and take a look at some of the top deals we've seen in recent trade deadline history and compare to see how this year fared with some blockbuster deals. We'll get into the history and big deals that we've seen recently coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we've had a pretty active NHL trade deadline for 2023. A lot of deals done a few days or even a week or more ahead of time. We see lots of big names traded between teams. Just to name a few, of course, we've seen Ryan O'Reilly go to the Leafs. We've seen Patrick Kane get moved. Tarasenko also going to the New York Rangers. A lot of those deals were done early. We've seen the Boston Bruins make a big trade with the Washington Capitals. And lots of other smaller deals all around and in between as well. So let's take a look back now at history in the last number of years to take a look at some of the bigger deals that we've seen and what kind of outcome they've led to, just so we can get an idea how this year's NHL trade deadline has fared compared to some recent active NHL seasons and some of the bigger deals we've seen. First up, I want to take a look back to March the 4th, 2009. That's when the New York Islanders traded Bill Guerin to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Of course, Bill Guerin is now the Minnesota Wild general manager. Worked with the Penguins a long time after retiring as well. They got a conditional draft pick in return, and Bill Guerin turned out to be exactly what Sidney Crosby and those young Penguins needed for assistance. He put up 15 points in 24 playoff games, and the Pittsburgh Penguins went on to win the 2009 Stanley Cup. That ended up being a tremendous deal for Pittsburgh, and a deal you can say that had a major impact on that outcome. Otherwise, would the Penguins been able to get through and win without Guerin? It's certainly debatable to say, and I think you might be able to say the odds would be against them without him. Now, also another big deal involving Pittsburgh, March 27th, 2013. This one didn't work out quite as well, but still had a fairly good impact. Jarome Iginla, longtime Calgary Flame captain, finally departs the Flames and is traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins. He put up 12 points in 15 playoff games, and unfortunately the Penguins ended up losing in the East Final to the Boston Bruins. The ironicness about this deal, though, is that Jarome Iginla actually thought he might have been traded to Boston. There was deals in the works. He did have a form of a no trade clause in his contract, and there was a deal with Boston that was reportedly agreed to first, but he rejected the trade when waive as no move, ended up going to Pittsburgh, and then lost against the Bruins. So obviously he later played for the Bruins in the subsequent season, but just kind of weird how that all worked out. A little bit later, March 5th, 2014, we saw a significant deal between the Lightning and the Rangers. The Rangers do have a history of being very active around the NHL trade deadline when they're trending towards not only being a playoff team, but when they think they have a chance to win. They trade up Martin St. Louis, of course, the current Montreal Canadiens head coach. Certainly a Hall of Fame career. St. Louis gets traded at the end of his tenure with Tampa to the New York Rangers, and of course, they got a pretty good return in former Ranger captain Ryan Callahan. I mean, that was a significant trade for sure. Callahan went on to play for a while in Tampa, and obviously had a decent run there. St. Louis put up 15 points in 25 playoff games for the Rangers that season, but unfortunately, they did not win the Stanley Cup. They ended up losing to the Los Angeles Kings. Of course, St. Louis didn't play much more after that, but, still, it was a significant deal. It was a big deal for St. Louis to leave Tampa. The Rangers made a major acquisition, and they came really close. The same deadline, actually the day before, March 4th, 2014, the Vancouver Canucks finally traded longtime goaltender Roberto Luongo. There's a long, never-ending seemed goalie controversy there between Luongo and Schneider. And Luongo was traded to the Florida Panthers. That's what brought Jacob Markstrom to Vancouver. Of course, took a while, but ended up having some good runs there before getting a huge free agent contract under the Calgary Flames. The Canucks also received Sean Mathias as part of that deal. The Florida Panthers, however, even with Luongo joining them late in the season, did not make the playoffs. Luongo did help them make the playoffs for the first time in several years, a couple of seasons later, but it took a while to get there. The 2016 NHL trade deadline on February 28th saw a longtime Carolina Hurricane forward and captain Eric Staal leave Carolina again to the New York Rangers. He got a chance to play with his brother Mark for 2 draft picks in return. They lost in the first round to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and Eric Staal put up 0 points. That that deal ended up being an absolute disaster. It did not work out for Eric Staal in the Big Apple at all. Of course, he later went on to play for Minnesota, and now he's in Florida after having a brief hiatus from the NHL. But the Eric Staal trade to the Rangers did not go so well at all. March 21st, 2022. This was obviously last year's trade deadline. The Montreal Canadiens traded Terry Lehkonen to the Colorado Avalanche. And you know what? I think a lot of people seen that deal and said, you know what? That's a good pickup for Colorado. But it wasn't good. It was great. Lehkonen is a tremendous fit there. Good playoff for forward. Scored some huge goals for them. Some of the deals that are, looked upon as being good or significant, but not necessarily the blockbuster deal, sometimes pay bigger dividends and are a huge reason for the team's winning. And Lehkonen played an absolutely huge role for the Colorado Avalanche in last year's march to the Stanley Cup. Montreal ended up getting a return a second-round pick and Justin Barrett. So we'll see how that works out for them long-term. Lehkonen stayed in Colorado afterwards on a new contract and is still performing well. We'll see how things go this playoff season. Back a couple of years ago, April 11th, 2021, we saw the big Taylor Hall trade. Buffalo, who had signed Hall to a one-year deal, was expected to likely move him at the deadline. They had an opportunity to sign him as a free agent, overpay him probably a little more than most teams could afford to do because of their cap situation, but then flip him at the deadline with some salary retained to get some assets back. So they traded Taylor Hall along with Curtis Lazar to the Boston Bruins. Of course, they got Anders Bjork and a second-round pick, so might seem underwhelming. Of course, Taylor Hall, as much as he didn't necessarily help them win the Stanley Cup that year, they did have some success, and he re-signed, and he's still a big part of that team. Curtis Lazar stayed for a while and then moved on as well. So all in all, for what they gave up, Boston, even though it didn't lead them to winning a cup, it did get them a long-term player, which certainly goes for something here as well. February 25th, 2019, the Ottawa Senators, of course, in the midst of their teardown, traded longtime forward and fan favorite Mark Stone to the Vegas Golden Knights. Of course, shortly thereafter, Mark Stone inked an 8-year contract. A lot long after that, was named captain. Unfortunately, he's dealing with back problems the past couple of years, but is absolutely, a huge part of that team. One of the game's top two-way forwards, one of the top two-way wingers for sure. And Mark Stone brought a return to Ottawa that included a second-round pick, Oscar Lindbergh, and of course, young defenseman Erik Brandstrom, who's finally starting to come into his own and become a regular this past year. So, all in all, I think the Sens could have done better on the deal, but Mark Stone didn't get them back to the Stanley Cup, but they're, looking for hardcore in Vegas since they've joined the NHL, but he became a huge part of the team's future. Hopefully his back will heal up eventually and can resume normal playing activity because he's just too good for the NHL to not be active right now, which is unfortunate for him. February 26, 2018, we saw another deal involving the New York Rangers, this time with the Tampa Bay Lightning again. The New York Rangers traded Captain Ryan McDonagh and JT Miller to the Lightning. In exchange, they got Vladislav Namestnikov, Brett Howden, Libor Hayek, and a 2018 first-round pick. So they get a pretty good return, but it was a huge haul for the Lightning, of course, who bring in a top four defenseman in McDonagh. Miller had a pretty good run there as well before he was later moved on as well. Did the Lightning, did they end up going to win the Stanley Cup that season? No, they did not, but they still had a really solid run. They had some big runs before they made it to the Stanley Cup. Of course, back-to-back cups in 20 and 21. And before that, like I said, they were really close for a couple of years before they pulled through. McDonagh was certainly sticking around long enough to be a big part of that. Miller had some short-term success there again before he was dealt. So, of course, he had later traded to Vancouver, where he is today, and they got a first-round pick for him. So, again, another pretty good management there by the Lightning. Another Ranger trade, February 25th, 2018, that same year. So, once again, another big deadline deal involving the New York Rangers, the same deadline, February 25th, 2018. After selling off McDonagh and Miller, they also traded Rick Nash. Rick Nash got traded from the Rangers to the Boston Bruins, another team who has a history of making big deadline deals. Of course, going back to the Rangers was Ryan Spooner, Matt Beleskey, Ryan Lindgren, who's now still a big part of that team's decor. They got a first-round pick in 2018 and a 2019 seventh-round pick. So, all in all, Rick Nash experiment in Boston didn't have a ton of success. He did okay in the regular season shortly after joining them after the trade, but throughout the playoffs, he ended up getting hurt, and the Bruins ultimately did not win the cup, which is what the intent was. So as much as the Bruins did have a good season overall, unfortunately for Nash, he didn't really have a huge contribution. February 9th, 2016, we saw just a little bit ahead of the deadline, but still a significant deal that was done just a little bit ahead between the two Canadian rivals in Ontario, the Ottawa Senators, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course, this deal was a big part of the Ottawa Senators' immediate future. Of course, 2016-17, the following season, they had a massive run to the Eastern Conference Final. Of course, they've got some pieces here, though, including Dion Phaneuf went to Ottawa from the Leafs. The former Leaf captain traded to Ottawa. Phaneuf was also traded with a bunch of minor leaguers that included Fratton, Bailey, Rupert, and Donaghy. Going to the Maple Leafs was a bunch of bad contracts. The Maple Leafs were still kind of tearing things down at that point. They got Greening, McCulloch, Cowan, Toby Lindbergh in a second-round pick. So all in all, Dion Phaneuf was the main piece there moved. Obviously, he stayed in Ottawa for a couple of years and was a big part of them going on the run, although it wasn't that year. It was the following year. But still, that was a big trade for Ottawa, which obviously complicated things a little while later, especially where Vegas came in with the expansion draft. They had to protect Phaneuf because of his no-move clause, which caused him to lose Marc Methot, and it kind of was the beginning of the end, so to speak, after the 2017 run. Now they're just starting to get back into being a competitive force and hopefully get into the playoffs, but even that's going to be a challenge considering this massive arms race we've seen in the Eastern Conference. We've seen a lot of teams load up. So obviously these are some of the bigger trade deadline deals that we've seen really in the last 13, 14 years. So the deals we've had this year, I think, could have the potential to be right up there on the scale if we did like a top 10 trade deadline deals of the last 10, 15 years. Some of the ones we've seen this year, including like the ones we've seen like with the Leafs of Ryan O'Reilly, Patrick Kane to the Rangers, Tarasenko. Some of these deals could end up being just as important and certainly provide a big push here for these teams. So let me know your thoughts on how this year's trade deadline was stacked up against some of these previous trade deadline deals, and let me know some of your fondest memories or biggest deals that you were, at least at the time, happy to see go down for your favorite team going into the playoffs. Let me know your thoughts on that, and we'll discuss in the comments. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching.